Traditionally, macroeconomists have highlighted three basic tools of monetary policy. To begin with, a central bank has the power to lend to commercial banks at any interest rate that it chooses. The interest rate, known as the discount rate in the United States, representing one of the three basic tools of monetary policy. By lowering its discount rate, a central bank can encourage commercial banks to borrow from it, since they in turn can lend out the borrowed money at a higher interest rate and make a profit on the deal. When commercial banks come to borrow that money, the central bank simply issues new money and lends it to them, thus increasing the money supply. And because there's a money multiplier based on the iterative deposit and lending process, the initial increase in the so called monetary base, the money that the central bank issues, will eventually spawn an even larger increase in M1. So M1 is your currency plus demand deposit, so your check. In this way, the central bank can increase the money supply by lowering its discount rate. That's true. Conversely, the central bank can contract the money supply or slow its growth by raising its discount rate. Another tool the central bank can use to manage the money supply is the reserve requirement on bank deposits. So your discount rate is equal to your interest rate. The reserve requirement, which is set by the central bank, dictates what proportion of every deposit banks are required to hold in reserve and does not lend out. Since the reserve requirement represents a leakage from the deposit and lending process, and since the money supplier is inversely related to the leakage, a higher reserve requirement will diminish the money multiplier. A higher reserve requirement will diminish the money multiplier and in turn reduce the money supply. A lower reserve requirement, by contrast, will raise the money multiplier and thus expand the money supply. In the example given earlier, where we assume no leakages other than a reserve requirement of 10%, the money multiplier was about 1 divided by 0.10. Starting with a monetary base of $100, M1 money supply, including both of currency in circulation and demand deposits, would swell to $1,000 as a result of the deposit and lending process. If the central bank reduced the reserve requirement to 5%, the money multiplier would rise to 20, and M1 would expand to $2,000. If instead the central bank increased the reserve requirement to 20%, the money multiplier would fall to 5, and the money supply would contract to just $500. The point is that a central bank can influence the money supply via the money multiplier by adjusting the reserve requirement. Finally, the third basic tool of monetary policy involves central bank purchases and sales of financial securities on the open market, known as open market operations. So, when the central bank wants to expand the money supply, it buys government bonds or other assets from private financial institutions, injecting cash into the economy. This is called an open market purchase. Since the central bank is purchasing financial assets, when a central bank wishes to contract the money supply or slow its growth, it executes an open market sale, selling assets to financial institutions and thus withdrawing cash from the economy. So, the three tools of monetary policy are the discount rate, reserve requirement, and open market operations. When the discount rate is higher or the interest rate is higher, borrowing by commercial banks lowers, which lowers the monetary base and lowers the money supply. But if the discount rate is lower, then commercial banks can borrow more money, so there will be more monetary base and more money supply. The reserve requirement is the amount of money that the bank should hold when lending out. So, when the reserve requirement is higher, there will be greater leakage, less money multiplier, less money supply. But when the reserve requirement is lower, there will be less leakage, more money multiplier, and more money supply. When there's open market purchases, when the central bank purchases assets, there will be injection of liquidity, which increases the monetary base and increases the money supply. When there is sales, there will be withdrawal of liquidity, resulting to less monetary base and less money supply. In the United States, open market operations represent the dominant method the Federal Reserve uses to move the overnight bank rate, known in the United States as the funds rate. The federal funds rate is the interest rate commercial banks charge one another for overnight lending. It is called the federal funds rate because banks typically lend and borrow funds that are on deposit at the Federal Reserve. Despite the name, no lending or borrowing by the federal government is involved. Prior to the financial crisis of 2007 to 2009, it had become quite rare for the Fed to lend directly to commercial banks for its discount window. In fact, the discount rate had become largely symbolic, playing almost no tangible role in US monetary policy. This changed during the crisis as the discount window became active again, but such direct lending diminished greatly once the crisis ended. Reserve requirements, meanwhile, are adjusted occasionally but not often. Open market operations have long been and remain the principal mechanism through which the Fed attempts to influence the money supply. It is worth repeating, however, that the purpose of open market operations, at least in a modern context and apart from recent experiments with so called quantitative easing, has generally been to move a particular short term interest rate, such as the federal funds rate, to a desired level. Although once fashionable, particularly in academic circles, the notion of aiming for a specific monetary target, such as a regular 3.5% rate of growth in the money supply, is really regarded as an end in itself anymore. In thinking about the sorts of economic relationships highlighted throughout this book, one very important thing to keep in mind is that they're not meant literally as descriptions of reality, but rather as baselines against which to compare and make sense of reality. A favorite expression among economists is ceteris paribus, which means with all other things constant. If all other factors were held constant as money supply rose, we would expect interest rates to fall. But as everyone knows, in real life, other factors hardly ever remain constant. Imagine, for instance, that just as the Federal Reserve executed an open market purchase to increase the money supply, Americans all across the country suddenly decided that they needed to hold more money in their wallets, under their mattresses, or in their checking accounts. Perhaps they had just received a warning about a major terrorist threat and thought it would be wise to keep more money on hand, even if this required liquidating some other assets, such as saving bonds or certificates of deposits. Whatever the case, demand for money would rise, and this would place upward pressure on interest rates, just as more demand for oil or any other product will tend to raise its price. The Federal Reserve might well find that although it had increased the money supply, its action was offset by an even larger increase in money demand, leading interest rates to rise rather than fall. The point of this little example is simply to remind you that the economic relationships described in these pages and in the pages of economic textbooks are not immutable laws of nature. In fact, they break down in practice all the time. If you take a look at data on money supply and interest rates for any country over any significant period of time, you'll find plenty of examples of interest rates rising as the money supply expands and interest rates falling as money growth slows, precisely the opposite of what an economics textbook would predict. But this does not mean that learning about these relationships is useless, far from it. Only by understanding the baseline relationships can you begin to recognize departures from the rule and, most important, begin to formulate reasoned explanations for what might be driving them. Wait up. A final topic of great importance in macroeconomics is expectations. Expectations about the future play a pivotal role in every market economy, influencing in one way or another nearly every economic transaction and decision. As we have seen, expectations can drive an entire economy in one direction or another and can even become self fulfilling. If depositors expect a bank to fail, it very well might if fearful depositors began pulling their money out en masse. Similarly, for the economy as a whole, expectations of inflation can produce the real thing, and an economy can fall into recession if enough people expect it to falter. These sorts of expectations are of particular interest to macroeconomists. The good news is that expectations can push economic reality not only in a negative direction but in a positive one as well. Sometimes these favorable expectations emerge on their own, at other times, many macroeconomists believe the government has to help cultivate them. In fact, managing expectations may well be most important function of macroeconomic policy, both monetary and fiscal.